Great.
Hello and welcome again to another episode of This Week in Christian History. And we are talking about this week something called the Scottish National Covenant. And we have a great guest on with us today, Professor Laura Stewart, who is a professor of early modern British history at York University. And she's going to help us understand even more about all of that. So, Professor, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it.
And thank you for the invite. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak to you about one of my early areas of research, and the area of research that I then built into my second book, Rethinking the Scottish Revolution. So it's a great privilege. Thank you.
Absolutely. And we're going to put links to those books in
Lovely.
our show notes and other things as well for people who would like to know. So, if somebody wants to understand what a Scotch Presbyterian is, this is a part of the conversation, isn't it? I mean, it's got to be, right?
Yes, I mean the National Covenant is historically one of the most important documents in consolidating a Presbyterian church and consolidating a Presbyterian identity, and that's a complicated story. A lot of people are under the impression that the Scottish Church is Presbyterian from the beginning, from
Ah,
1560, and of course the Scottish Presbyterians who in the 17th century propagate that idea. But that's not actually strictly true. In the 16th century, there are a lot of arguments over how the Scottish Church should be governed, much less argument over doctrine. Doctrine is slammed down with the 1560 Confession of Faith, and there's a lot less debate in Scotland than there is in England. At the same time, around what the true doctrine of the church should be. But where things are contentious in Scotland is over how the church should be governed. And that has implications for the status of the ruler, for the status of King James VI of Scotland, later First of England, self-proclaimed first King of Britain.
right.
Because do you want to hear a little bit about a
Oh,
Presbyterian
please.
church?
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
because I
yeah.
think that's a context into that. I mean, my thought always was if you kind of get into the Catholic Protestant flow, and that after Queen Elizabeth dies and Parliament and others want to make sure that there's no doubt that there's another, a Protestant on the throne, right? And they got to go all the way back up to Henry VII and come all the way back down and go all
Yes.
the way back down again to get to James. They did all of that because they certainly didn't want a Catholic on the throne. And so, how Presbyterian? I mean, how Protestant are you? Are you not? And then, and I'm talking more than I'm asking now. But I mean, and then Charles the First, who certainly has got plenty of Catholic leanings, right? If he's not Catholic himself, okay, about
He's
what
not.
with it, right? I mean, the background of all of that, I think, fits squarely into our conversation, doesn't it? Or
Yes,
if you give it,
absolutely.
I may have totally messed all that up. So,
No, not at all, not at all. So the Scottish and English churches are both Protestant by the middle of the 16th century. And the Scottish Reformation is pretty brisk in comparison to the English one.
mm,
As I'm sure your audience know, there's a lot more debate in England under Mary the First, Mary Tudor. A Protestant church actually goes back to the Catholic faith and goes back to Rome, and then it swings back again with her death and the coming in of Elizabeth I. But in Scotland, it's in many ways much more straightforward. The Protestant Reformation is a rebellion against Mary, Queen of Scots, and her authority, and the authority of her mother, Mary of Guise, who was regent
mhm.
for her in the 1560s. But as I said earlier, when the Scots convene in Parliament and they pass legislation that brings in a confession of faith and repudiates the papal mass and papal authority, then the doctrine of the church becomes relatively uncontentious.
Now, I'm sorry, when you say Parliament, you mean the Scottish Parliament,
The Scottish Parliament,
right?
yes.
Right.
So
We're not talking
Scotland's
about, right. Okay.
Yeah. So I should have clarified that Scotland and England are entirely separate and independent countries at this time.
Hmm.
Mary, Queen of Scots, comes back to Scotland after the Protestant Reformation in 1561, but she refuses to ratify the legislation that's brought the new church into being. And this is very important because it
Hmm.
means that there isn't a monarch driving religious reform in Scotland. It's the church that takes upon itself the business of governing itself and of Protestantizing the people. So the church from the get-go has a level of independence from secular authority in Scotland that you don't see in England, where it is monarchs who are leading the reform process. So where does this business about Presbyterianism come? Well, as I said, the Scottish Church is not Presbyterian from the outset. And the question of how the church is going to be governed is a difficult one. The Scottish Church doesn't repudiate bishops. So historically, the bishops are the people who've governed the church. They do get rid of the monastic houses. All of those religious houses are dissolved, but they don't get rid of bishops. And what they do instead is try to experiment with a different form of government. They experiment with superintendents, and these were lay people who would lead the church. But that period of experimentation draws to a close as James VI becomes an adult monarch. So his mother has been thrown off the throne. She's been forced to abdicate, and there's then a civil war. So she abdicates in, James is born in 1566, she abdicates in 1567. She flees to England, and she will spend the rest of her life as the prisoner of Elizabeth I. Elizabeth does not know what to do with her. But as James comes to adulthood, he's a precociously well-educated king. He's educated by one of the great minds of 16th century Europe, a man called George Buchanan. And James, as he grows to adulthood, is developing his own ideas about how he would like the church to be governed. And what he doesn't like is a church that asserts its own authority separate from that, from the secular ruler. And we refer to that as the royal supremacy. So James starts to develop the idea of the supremacy of the monarch in both the civil and the ecclesiastical spheres. But by the time James is moving into adulthood, the church has been governing itself for several decades. And although it doesn't start out as Presbyterian, many historians think that in the second generation, once we get into the 1570s, and with the return to Scotland of a man called Andrew Melville, who's a teacher, a theologian, we see the emergence of more fully formed Presbyterian ideas. This idea of two kingdoms, that the secular and religious spheres are separate but complementary. And that's mirrored by the way that the church is governed, because instead of having bishops with their dioceses who govern the church in the localities, you have a Presbyterian hierarchy of courts. At the top, you have something called the General Assembly. And in the 16th century, it's meeting at least every year, sometimes twice a year. And the General Assembly is made up of elected members. So it's got in inverted commas, democratic aspect to it, which a king like James VI is going to find quite troubling.
Or maybe Republican, right, of sorts. I mean, not everybody, does everybody go and have a say-so? Anybody can go? Or is it like the Presbyterian Church works? No, you elect somebody as your elders or your delegates or somebody that goes to the conference or to the assembly or part of it. Okay.
That's absolutely right. So it's not democratic in a modern sense of the word, in that people have the right to vote as human beings. It's nothing like that. But there is an elective element to it that means that James can't control the members of the General Assembly, and that worries him. Below that, you still have synods. They're a regional court. Then below that, you have the entity that in some ways is most troubling for James, and this is the presbyteries. And presbyteries are not rolled out in Scotland until 1581. And James, again, doesn't like them because he can't control them because of the elective element. But that's where the term Presbyterian is most closely associated with that particular court in the middle of the hierarchy. Below that, you have an extremely useful court at parish level, and that's called the Kirk Session. And Kirk Sessions have existed right from the start of the Reformation, and that's where parishioners, elders of the Kirk, and their ministers get together and manage church affairs, manage parish affairs. These days, Kirk Sessions are often associated with discipline, with men sitting in judgment over their neighbours, and they're often seen, I think, not unfairly as obsessed with people's morality. But in an early modern context, they serve a very useful social function. So James doesn't want to get rid of Kirk sessions. Nobody wants to get rid of Kirk sessions because they're really, really useful. But presbyteries are more of a problem because James sees them as a means by which ministers and active lay elders can mobilise against royal policy, and he just sees them as uncontrollable. So that's where we get this distinction between Presbyterian and Episcopalian. But what we can't forget about the Scottish context is that really the system that emerges is a hybrid one. So despite the best efforts of committed Presbyterians, the Scottish Church never fully gets rid of bishops in the 16th century. The implication is that they're going to wither away because the Presbyterian system will take over.
Okay.
But James is the one who puts a spanner in those works. And from the later part of the 16th century, and especially into the early part of the 17th century, you see James working to restore the authority of the bishops and to undermine the independent capacity of the General Assembly. And there's important legislation that's passed in the early part of the 17th century that, to cut a long story short, restores the bishops to their full temporal and ecclesiastical jurisdiction. There's a lot of opposition to that. Presbyterians are upset by that, but they struggle to mobilise effective opposition in Parliament. So James is able to get the General Assembly and Parliament to restore the bishops, restore them to their full jurisdiction. And Presbyterians, as I say, struggle to they can get people upset about it, but they can't stop it from happening.
But none of this has taken place in the Church of England, right?
No, none of this. So there is a Presbyterian movement in England, and it's crushed in the 1580s and 1590s.
Interesting. Okay.
And that will be important for the future of the English Church, because when the English, with the collaboration of the Scots in the Civil War period in the 1640s, try to create a Presbyterian church, it doesn't have the underpinnings that it does in Scotland. It doesn't have a consistent existence as a meaningful system of church government in England, as is the case in Scotland right through this period.
How fascinating. Okay, we're enjoying our conversation that we're having with Professor Laura Stewart. This is great information, right? And so interesting for us to learn more about how we're getting to the whole part of the Scottish National Covenant. All right, sorry. I just wanted to say thank you again. So we've got James. So when James is doing this undermining, or this, as we might say, he's doing some good politicking, right?
Yes, he certainly is.
And he's figuring out how to get his votes and get done what he wants to get done. He's kind of looking at a chessboard here, right? It's kind of what are my plays going to be, et cetera. When he's doing those things, he is now also James the First of England, or is he still, or he's strictly on the Scottish throne?
So some of this activity begins before 1603. It's not that James goes down to England and suddenly says, oh, the English church looks a lot more like the kind of church I want to be head of. He's already moving towards the restoration of episcopal jurisdiction while he's King of Scotland. But in 1603, Elizabeth I, who has not had any children of her own, finally dies to the relief of an awful lot of people, especially King James VI. And there's a surprisingly peaceful accession. And James sprints down to England almost as soon as he gets the news. But it changes the context in which he's debating with the Scottish Church. James is now far more powerful as King of England, and also its dependency of Ireland, Kingdom of Ireland. And James is able to move forward with his plans for the Scottish Church without having to take so much account of what the Church itself thinks back in Scotland. So as King of England, self-proclaimed King of Britain, what James wants to do is try and make his kingdoms more like one another. And that makes sense to early modern people. If you are trying to govern completely different countries and completely different peoples, doesn't it make sense to try and bring its institutions more into line with one another? James has a very, very ambitious plan for a closer union in the early part of the 17th century. And the union programme that he launches in 1604 has unravelled by 1607, mostly through the hostility of the English Parliament. But what James is very, very conscious of is that the two churches are very different from one another. And one way that he could try and bring his peoples more into line with one another, that's not the right way to put it, to try and build the sense of a British people rather than English people and Scottish people and Welsh people and Irish people. Why don't we try and make the churches more like one another? The other thing that James is worried about is that if you've got two churches that are different from one another, although they're both Protestant and similar in doctrinal terms at this time, nonetheless, it's possible for people who are discontented with the way that the church operates in one or other of the countries to make common cause across the border. So James is very, very acutely aware of that. So the context of the union of the crowns is really, really important for understanding where the national covenant comes from. It's very, I'm counterfactual history can have its uses, but it is very difficult to imagine how the civil wars could have happened in the way that they did, that the national covenant could have come about in the way that it did without that British context. It's all so important.
Wow.
But we're a little bit running ahead of ourselves because
no, we're good.
So James, we've got him now as King of England. He's been able to restore episcopal authority, and he's done that very successfully. But what happens next, I think, is that James pushes too far and too fast in terms of how he wants to reform the Scottish Church. And in the 1610s, James decides that he's managed to get the government of the two churches broadly in alignment with one another, but they worship differently. And a simple way to think about this is that in Scotland, ministers don't have a set text. So preaching in Scotland, the preaching of the word is one of the central and most important things about church worship. And the Church of Scotland, although liturgies have been in use in the 16th century, they're not completely ruled out. The official texts of the church don't endorse it. And most Scots see a liturgy as a throwback to Catholic practice because they deeply value what we call extempore preaching. Is that extempore preaching where the minister is moved by the Holy Spirit is a far more edifying way to hear the word of God. In England, you have a prayer book, and every single church, in theory, uses the prayer book at the same time on a Sunday, and they worship according to the same rites. And there are good reasons for having a prayer book, and there's a lot of loyalty to the prayer book in England. But those two systems are different from one another in terms of how people worship. And James doesn't, again, like this very much. It seems peculiar. If there is one truth, if God wanted us all to worship in one way, why am I presiding over two completely different systems? So harmonise them. But he wants to harmonise them on the basis of the English church, and that causes a great deal of upset. James's policies in this regard become known as the 5 Articles of Perth. And that's because there's a General Assembly that's held at Perth, and James presents 5 articles dealing with certain important facets of Scottish worship. But the most important one and the most controversial one, and the one that generates the most opposition, is the injunction to kneel at communion. So again, differences between the Scottish and the English churches. The English tend to kneel to take communion, not exclusively, but the Scots do not. The Scots see that as an idolatrous practice. Their practice is to sit at tables, and this represents the Last Supper. It represents the fellowship of all Christians and their fellowship with God. And from most lowland Scots, that's how they would take communion. So when James says, we're not going to do that anymore, you're going to kneel, then there's a huge rumpus about this. Presbyterians are very organised. They mobilise resistance, and again it fails. In 1621, James is able to get Parliament to ratify the Assembly's legislation. So people vote with their feet. They walk out of their churches. Not all the time. They're not schismatics. So they'll go to church on Sunday, but in the communion seasons, they will go to other churches where they can get communion seated, because they think that is the correct and right way that God intended communion to be taken. So that context is really, really important for understanding where the national covenant comes from. We haven't even got to the reign of Charles I. James will die in 1625, and his son Charles will inherit. But we need to understand the difficult legacy that James passes to his son. At the end of James's life in the 1620s.
Before we get to Charles, may I ask a question about that?
Yeah, of course you can.
That kind of fits into what you're talking about, the control and the structure, and then the authorized version right, of what we would call the King James Bible, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it is still, it seems we need conformity here. In
yeah,
addition, I don't like the Geneva Bible. Elizabeth didn't like the Geneva Bible. We don't like all those notes in there. We don't like all those
yes,
little
yes,
the commentaries that say, yes, the Hebrew midwives broke the law, but they did the right thing, right? We don't need those kind of comments in our Bible, right? And so
yes,
not only the scholarship thing, but we've got to have an authorized version so that at least when we're talking about scripture, there's not any question about the apocrypha or about whatever this
yeah,
is the thing. And we all kind of, and so I'm bringing all these scholars together to make sure that we have at least something that is our base to work from, maybe if nothing else. Is that a
yes.
stretch, or is that probably
No, I
about
don't. I
right?
don't think so. And it's an extraordinary literary achievement, not just an
Mm.
achievement in terms of creating authoritative text. You know, when I was a child, my parents were churchgoers. I'm not one now, but my parents were, and you still encounter the authorized version.
Oh gosh, yes.
Yeah, yeah. So yes, it's an extraordinary thing. And yes, that's all part of James's, bigger ambitions to assert his own authority as a king who has sacral functions.
Yes. Okay.
And as I say, he does that very successfully. The fact of the matter is, you're not going to get the population at large so exercised about episcopal government and so exercised about the assertion of the king's supremacy in the church that they're going to rebel against your authority. But you start messing with worship, that affects everybody who goes to church, and they
It's
are
personal
confronted with
now.
that.
It's
Yeah,
personal now on a level
it
that the
becomes
other
much more
was
personal.
is more,
Well, that's
look,
how the church is governed.
I
These
got to
are
be governed.
esoteric
We get
questions. Yeah.
that. We don't want to have to go back and, we get that structure. We got to have those things, right? Because we never
Yes.
know when there might be a wayward Spaniard that comes over the wall or something, right? I mean, we understand we got to do those
Yes.
things, but you
And
start dealing with how I'm dealing in my relationship with God, you're getting in something that is not your business. I mean, it's not, is that right? No.
yeah, absolutely. And I
Yeah.
was just going to say, you've rightly mentioned Spaniards coming over the wall,
Right.
because an important context for what's going on at the end of James's life is the outbreak of the 30 Years' War.
Hmm.
And the 30 Years' War does what it says on the tin. It lasts around about 30 years, and it kicks off in 1618, round about the same time that James is thinking about these issues about conformity and uniformity and unity, because Europe is being devastated by religious conflict. Now, the 30
Hmm.
Years' Wars are actually a series of wars. They're incredibly complicated. They're dynastic as much as they are religious. But it's very, very close to home for the British peoples, because it directly involves James's own daughter, Elizabeth, Elizabeth of Bohemia. And she
Hmm.
marries a Protestant prince, Frederick of the Palatinate. And the kick-off to the 30 Years' Wars involves the attack on his acceptance as a Protestant of the Crown of Bohemia. So I'm not going to go into that in more detail because A, I
Right,
don't know
right.
enough about it, but B, it's also immensely complicated. But I think to try and understand why these issues are so controversial, why people are so upset about them, you have to remember that Catholic armies are on the march in Europe, and they are bulldozing over not just Protestants, but Protestants who are directly related to the British royal house.
Sure.
So this again is part of the legacy that Charles I inherits. And historians have, well, pretty much since the 17th century itself, have argued over what kind of King James was in comparison to what kind of King Charles was. And James these days tends to get a much better viewpoint from historians. Charles tends to be seen as a king who is not as savvy as James, is not as prepared to make sincere compromises. And a lot of that is true. He's a lot more rigid than his father. Certainly, his own religious views are very conventional. He's a Protestant. There's no doubt he's a Protestant, but he's
Hmm.
got ideas about conformity, uniformity, unity that his father was, for most of his life, prepared to be more flexible on. So it's very important to say that Charles is not in any way a Catholic, and nothing that Charles does is actually about trying to restore the Catholic faith. He is married to a Catholic. He's married to a French princess, Henrietta Maria, and as their marriage cements, it becomes a love match. Not at the beginning, but once they become closer with one another, she becomes an important advisor to him. But Charles himself is a conventional Protestant. And again, it can be difficult for modern audiences to understand why people were so upset about Charles I when he was a Protestant as well.
Right.
But what we've been doing so far is to talk about the way in which the English and Scottish churches are quite distinctive from one another, and that
Hmm.
matters to Scots. It matters to their sense of identity, their sense of nationhood, in the wake of a union that increasingly seems to be subordinating their interests to those of the larger, richer kingdom down south. And it's over religious issues that this is going to become especially controversial. So we've made it up to 1625. James dies. Charles inherits the throne, and most people are not quite sure what they're going to get from Charles, but it quickly becomes apparent that he intends fully to build on his father's legacy and to take his father's ideas forward. And one of the ways that he wants to do this is to advance on his father's successes in restoring episcopal jurisdiction in Scotland and making changes to worship. Charles himself comes to Scotland to be crowned as King of Scots in 1633, and it's a public relations disaster.
Oh,
So Charles comes up with his English entourage and his English bishops, including his Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, and they worship according to English rites. And most Scots, particularly in Edinburgh is a bulwark of Presbyterianism. They're really offended by the things that Charles is doing. Charles, for his part, sees the Scottish Church as disorderly and irreverent. And he says, in conjunction with his Archbishop of Canterbury, what they need is a prayer book. So let them work on a prayer book, present it to us, we'll look over it, and we'll institute a prayer book. Laud has a lot to do with this. Charles himself annotates drafts, but it is actually worked up by Scottish bishops and conformist ministers. So it's not an English imposition. But where things go wrong, if that's the way to put it, is that Charles attempts to impose the prayer book by fiat. So he does it through his Privy Council on his own prerogative. He doesn't consult a General Assembly and he doesn't consult Parliament. And when the prayer book is publicly read for the first time in Edinburgh, it's appeared in other places prior to this, but the big one is Edinburgh. Edinburgh's the capital. So if you're going to roll out new religious policies, you have to get the capital to accept them.
sure.
Well, there's absolute uproar. The government has given Presbyterians plenty of time to organise against the book. Nobody's seen the dashed thing. So it's very easy for Presbyterians to start putting it out there that the prayer book is the Mass, it's the Romish Mass. There's all these things in it that are they're trying to make us conform more with England. And where are they going with that? They're trying to make us conform more with Rome, and that's the direction of travel. So there's absolute uproar, sorry, on the day that it's first read in St Giles, which has been raised to a cathedral in the middle of the 1630s. And it's very clear that the demonstrations are organised, choreographed, they're frightening, they're really intimidating, but there isn't actually very much violence. So nobody's killed. Some bishops have the living daylights frightened out of them, but they're not, and they are physically attacked in the sense that people pull at their garments and jostle them on the streets. But it's important that the crowds don't actually harm anybody.
Mm.
Another important facet of the demonstrations against the prayer book is that women are very prominent. Women have been part of the organising.
Mm-hmm.
It's traditionally women who sit at the front of the church. There are no pews in Scotland at this time. And people take their own stools to sit on, and it's the women who sit at the front. And so they are the obvious people to get the demonstrations going. It's also likely that if women are demonstrating, then the town authorities are going to be less rough with them. They're not going to attack women. they're also likely to see them as less threatening than men. So
Mhm.
again, this is all about how these demonstrations are being choreographed to show that this is a demonstration against the prayer book. It is not trying to overthrow the government.
Right.
And in the wake of the demonstrations, what should have happened is that the prayer book was paused, and it should have been the case that there was proper dialogue between the king and his leading advisors and the people who are behind these demonstrations. They don't show themselves at first. The only people who are arrested are some serving women. And again, the Privy Council in Scotland, that's the council that rules Scotland in the absence of the king. They do that quite deliberately. So they're trying to show this is a demonstration and we can fix this. We can come to some sort of
Mhm.
resolution. But that doesn't happen because Charles won't back down from the book. And this leaves the Presbyterians in something of a dilemma. You know, we've shown you that we don't want the prayer book, but you haven't heard us. So where do you go next? And that becomes potentially very problematic for Presbyterians because if the king just says no and says no and says no, then they are pushed to more and more extreme action. And they're going to push to the point where the king can say, this country is in rebellion, so we're going to use force against you. And the Presbyterians are very reluctant to get to that point. Obviously,
Mhm.
what you really want is some sort of compromise. But Charles doesn't appear to know how serious the situation is in Scotland. And again, historians debate what's going on here. Is it that Charles didn't want to know how serious it was? Did he not realise how serious it was? Does he just see it as an assault on his authority
Mhm.
and feels incapable of making the kinds of compromises that I personally feel are necessary at this point? Or is he being badly advised? Is it his advisors who are not giving him the information he needs to make good decisions? I suspect my personal feeling is that Charles took the advice he wanted.
Mhm.
So he's not listening to the people who say what you need to do is withdraw the book and stop this growing into an attack on the church establishment, an attack on the bishops. And that's what happens. In the later 1630s, um, the Presbyterians who've launched the demonstrations against the prayer book, when they don't get what they want, they take it up a level and they embark on what we call the supplication campaign, where they start bombarding the Privy Council with petitions against the prayer book. Almost all of them are about the prayer book. They demand a General Assembly and a Parliament so that religious grievances can be heard, a legitimate part of political discourse. But in these supplications, you also start to see attacks on the bishops. That's becoming very serious now. It's not going to be enough to get rid of the prayer book and probably the five articles of Perth as well. Presbyterians are mobilising against the episcopal establishment. They want to take it down. Now, at this point, again, my personal feeling is that there's not a lot of support for that. What generates support for that is the king will not compromise.
Right.
So Presbyterians are able to say, look, we told you all along that restoring episcopal jurisdiction and then making the changes to worship and then the prayer book. We said that this was about conforming with England and ultimately conforming with Rome. And we see here that as a nation, we've said the prayer book is against our religion. The king will not hear us. So where do we go from here?
Right.
And into the early part of 1638, the people who are leading the supplication campaign realize that they're running out of petitioning opportunities. There's no more they can do here, and the king still won't compromise. So how do they take their campaign to another level? And what they come up with is a national covenant. So your obvious next question is, well, what is the national covenant?
Right.
It's
But I mean, do you, I mean, let's back on Charles, right? I mean,
sure.
we're leading up to the English Civil War, right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
coming. And so um, uh, from what I have gathered and set me straight on this, if this is not right, but Charles has a very full, healthy impression of himself, right? And his ability to
Yeah.
be able to. So you throw in some arrogance, throw in a little testosterone on top of all of that, and then you throw all that into the mix, and because I'm the king. I mean, this is divine rights of kings thought
Yep.
processes because I said so. And I don't have to go ask you something else about that. That's what we're trying to do. I'm not trying to turn you into Buddhists. I'm not trying to put you back into being Roman Catholics. I'm not trying, that's not, you may take it that way, but this is what we need. I'm the king. Why are we, from his perspective, why are we even having these conversations anymore? I mean,
Yeah.
it's over. Let's move on. But it's
But
not.
I'm
Right.
Charles gets this from his father. He,
Mm,
he he sees himself as God's anointed, and it
mhm,
is his responsibility to be a nursing father to his people.
mm,
And it is entirely legitimate for, as Charles sees it, as actually most English people and most of his advisors would see, it's entirely legitimate for the king to make decisions about what the church should look like, unless there's something in scripture that says you must do this or you must
mhm,
not do this.
mhm.
And church government is one of those areas where most early modern people would say kings, princes have a lot of latitude because
Yeah.
there isn't a form of government
Right.
scripturally warranted.
Right.
Presbyterians, or what we call Ure Divino Presbyterians, argue against that. They say God has mandated, the Bible mandates that the church should be governed as a Presbyterian church. And again, I'm not a theologian. You need to speak to a
No, no, no,
biblicist
that's
to
fine. But I
explain
mean,
where
it's
that
good
scripture warranted
context.
comes
Right.
from. Yeah. So what you've got are two uncompromising sets of people.
Hmm.
Charles, who's got a very decided view of his own authority, and Presbyterians who believe that they are also doing the work of God, and that a
Hmm.
Presbyterian church is mandated in Scripture. Um, so we're into the National Covenant now,
Yes.
and I just need to say a little bit about where this document comes from.
Right. And this is
Um,
1638, right?
this is
Are we at 37
1638.
going into 38?
So
Because,
37 going into 38.
okay, okay.
Yes, yeah. So Charles is trying to shut down this supplicating movement, this petitioning movement. And we don't know exactly where the idea for a covenant comes from.
Mm,
There is a legacy in Scotland in the 1580s and 1590s of Scots banding together for religious causes. But it certainly falls out of official favour in the late 1590s and into the early part of the 17th century. I think there are places in Scotland where covenanting remains important. And what do we mean by that? We mean people bonding together in the sight of God. And that legacy, I think, does persist across the early part of the 17th century, but it's been marginalised. As I say, it's not supported by the church, it's certainly not supported by the secular government. So there is a legacy of that kind that the Scots can draw on in a way that is much less the case in England. There is a whole theological position on covenanting, the idea of covenants of grace. This is an external covenant, not an internal one. They're not likening the covenant to the body of the elect. They are covenanting all of the people of Scotland, both elect and reprobate, because of course we don't know who is elect and who's reprobate, together in this band. And it's a band in all perpetuity. So all the Scottish people band together in the sight of God with one another and with God. And that part of the national covenant is sworn in congregations all over Scotland in 1638. So the bond is the solemn engagement made with God and that people make with one another. And what's really important about this is that you don't see town councils or lords swearing or signing the national covenant on behalf of the people.
Ah,
So it has radical implications because individuals are swearing and signing the covenant on their own account. We'll talk maybe a little bit later about some of the limitations on that radicalism. But this is what makes the covenant an absolutely extraordinary document. There is, to my mind, nothing like it in early modern Europe at this time. There
mhm.
will be all kinds of protestations and vows and indeed covenants in England in Civil War England. But at this moment in time, in 1638, the National Covenant is unique. And it's a document that's unique to Scotland. It's unique to Scotland because it describes what an ideal Scottish church should look like. So I've said that part of the national covenant is a bond between people in the sight of God. There's a second part to the covenant, which is a very boring list of acts of General Assembly and Parliament. Why is that there? Partly to give the covenant legitimacy, but
Mm.
also what that actually describes is a Presbyterian church. So nowhere does the covenant mention bishops or mention episcopacy, and I don't think it explicitly uses the word Presbyterian, but anyone who read through those acts of General Assembly and Parliament would have come to the conclusion that the church that it's describing is a Presbyterian church. So this is a really threatening document for the
Right.
church establishment.
I didn't say the thing was a duck, but I did say it quacks. I did say it waddles, and it
Yeah,
also has a green head, and
yes.
it flies, and it does this. I'm not saying it's a duck. I'm just describing what it
I
is.
mean,
Okay, right.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly it. But the other feature, there's a third component of the National Covenant, and it's called the 1581 Confession. And that was a document that was ultimately signed by James VI and some of his leading privy councillors of the time. And that is essentially a statement against the Catholic faith. So it doesn't say anything that would be considered controversial by Protestant Scots. And it's also a document that older generations of Scots would have known about and would have been familiar with. These three elements together make up the National Covenant. And there are questions raised at the time and questions that historians have asked about the legitimacy and the legality of the covenant. At this point, no General Assembly has met, no
Okay.
Parliament has met, the Privy Council certainly hasn't authorised it, and the King hasn't authorised it. So why do people sign this thing? Where does its legitimacy come from? One radical interpretation is that its authority comes from the people of Scotland and the bond that they make together in the sight of God. That it's Scots in their own congregations, surrounded by their own family, their friends, that gives this thing legitimacy. And that takes us into the swearing ceremonies, which must have been very, very intense emotional experiences for people. So you can imagine that in 1638, there's political uproar, the king's government is collapsing, people are frightened there's going to be a war, they don't know what's happening, the king opposes this thing. There are arguments going on in individual parishes about the future of the church. But the point of the covenant for those ministers that take it in 1638 is to try and bring congregations together, to try and restore unity. And we know from some of the records that we have from the time that in some places entire congregations are swearing the covenant together. They've had weeks of preparation, they've had the covenant read to them. Their ministers have given sermons to explain what the covenant is about. They have prepared themselves in terms of reconciliations with their neighbours, with the Kirk Session members have come to families who are in dispute to try and reconcile disputes that are going on in the neighbourhood, so that when you come to the point where they are swearing the covenant in their congregations, then the idea is that the covenant will restore the unity of a divided church, in some cases divided parishes who've fallen out over things like the 5 Articles of Perth. So it must have been a very, very powerful communal experience, but also potentially quite a daunting one. There must have been people who had doubts. How do you express that when everybody around you is standing up with their hands raised up? There are people
Right.
crying in the church.
What if I think the king's right?
Yeah.
What if I think Charles is right?
What if you think Charles is right?
I mean,
Yeah.
and I'm here, and I kind of have this reverse pressure going on me around. Everybody else is going, yes, 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 go, 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 and I might go, I don't know, I don't know
Yeah.
whether I really want to
Yes.
sign that thing or not.
Yes, I certainly there are parts of Scotland where the covenant was not supported, or there were communities that were very divided. So a place that's really badly divided is the city of Aberdeen. That's the second city of Scotland after the capital Edinburgh, and they have long-standing disputes going on in the town about religious reform, and so the town council is divided over whether they should support the covenant or not. So it's not that everybody warmly endorses the covenant. That's certainly not the case. But I think in large parts of Scotland, the covenant is genuinely popular, partly because it's constructed out of these historic elements that people understand and know, particularly the 1581 confession, but also the Acts of General Assembly and Parliament. It is this powerful emotional experience that for a lot of people, it would have been seen as something that was trying to restore the unity of congregations and the unity of the church.
Hmm.
So it's a very, very powerful thing that people have entered into. It comes with an awesome level of personal and communal responsibility for religious, spiritual, moral reform. And we'll see some of that play out across the 1640s. But I also think that element of personal and communal reform, that sense that you take responsibility for your own salvation, that will make the national covenant something that people can turn to in later decades. It floats free of its initial political meanings
Mm.
from the late 1630s. But that call for spiritual renewal is something that people will still think is very, very important long after the covenant has ceased to be a document underpinning the existence of a national church.
Wow.
It's a truly extraordinary thing.
Well, this is
And as
true.
I,
I mean,
again,
this whole
that's
time
why.
period, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's why I mean, all the interconnects to anything that we would call the greater, bigger, maybe longer Protestant Reformation, right? I mean, I tell my students all the time, Jesus didn't give the 12 apostles a three-ring binder and go out and say, this is how you,
Yes.
here's
This
how
is how
you
you do
do
it.
it. Okay. I
Yeah.
mean, been
Yeah.
easier. Okay. I mean, but this is kind of how you set it up. And so how that ends up evolving in different places, depending on, you can't take governance and kings and queens and princes and politics out of the dialogue and conversation anywhere, right? That you're looking into
No.
it. It's not purely ecclesiastical by any stretch, right? And how do those things interact with each other? And what do we believe is scripture? What do we not believe is scripture? How do we understand that this is how that's interpreted? Who gets to be the interpreter? You know, things ran a heck of a lot cleaner when there was just one guy being the decider on everything,
Yes.
right? So it's
Yes.
but if that's not happening, then we got to kind of figure out what that looks like. So what was the ultimate then? Would you say is the legacy today that really that was that came after the covenant?
So for many centuries, the covenant is going to be a very, very important document in defining what is distinctive about the Scottish Church, what is
Hmm.
distinctive about its own Reformation. And this isn't so much about the content of the National Covenant. Most people probably don't know what's in it. I think that these mass swearing ceremonies, where perhaps for the only time in their lives, ordinary people were asked to give their consent to something, to
Ah,
this political act, political with a small p, of giving consent to what the church should look like, and a certain sort of constitution for Scotland, because of course we come back to all those acts of parliament that are in the national covenant. So it's not just talking about how the church should be, it's also talking about, or it's implying a certain form of state. And
uh-huh.
that's it's a parliamentary state. Yes, the king is incredibly important, because one thing I forgot to mention is that the covenant is very strongly supportive of monarchic authority. It upholds the person, the office, the authority of King Charles I. And Covenanters say we are loyal to King Charles I, and most of them mean it.
Mm.
As events unfold over the 1640s, Scots are constantly going to be tested over the relationship between their loyalty to the monarch and their primary loyalty in the covenant to the true Reformed faith. And if those things are in contradiction with one another, what do you do? And they will be asked again and again and again in the 1640s, what do you do? The It doesn't go well in the end. for the Scots. There's a civil war in the 1640s, and that civil war takes place in England, and the Scots will go into the war with the English Parliament against Charles I. And the events of that period are far too complicated for us to talk about
Sure, sure.
today. But the upshot is that Scotland, well, Charles I is executed by his English, or a faction of his English subjects in 1649. And the Scots stay true to the covenant, and they declare his son Charles II as king. And Scotland is then invaded by the English New Model Army headed by Oliver Cromwell, and Scotland is conquered for 10 years by the English. It's run by an English regime. When that republic collapses and Charles II is restored, things get even worse for Covenanters because the Covenants are actually outlawed. They're publicly burned by the common hangman, and people aren't forced to renounce the covenant publicly, but you can't hold office if you're a Covenanter. An Episcopal church is restored, but not prayer books. So the 1660s, 70s, 80s are really bad times for Covenanters. With the revolution in 1689, a Presbyterian, this is when James VII and II, the brother of Charles II, in England abdicates from his throne, but in Scotland is actually forfeited. But at any rate, William of Orange and his wife Mary become the rulers of the British kingdoms. And in Scotland, a Presbyterian church is restored. But that church does not restore the covenants, and efforts by some Covenanters to re-covenant the church, they're completely ignored. And it would have been an incredibly divisive thing to do by that time. But for a lot of Scots, the important thing here is that a lot of Scots think that the church is still bound by the covenants, even though the covenants have not been renewed. Those covenanted duties are still intrinsic to what it means to be a Scot and a Presbyterian. As I said earlier, there will never be a moment where the covenant will be renewed, and it will never ever again underpin a national church. By this time, religious pluralism is a fact of Scottish life. People who had been happy under a restored Episcopal church in the 1660s, 70s, 80s, they continue to exhibit a different confessional culture from Presbyterians, and they stay largely outside of the new Church of Scotland, the restored Presbyterian church. They will benefit finally from the introduction of toleration, limited toleration in 1712. There's toleration in England for dissenters in 1689, but that doesn't happen in Scotland for Episcopalians. Episcopalians only get toleration of a limited kind in 1712. So religious pluralism, as I say, has become a factor of religious life, and you can't turn the clock back to the 1640s.
Right.
And indeed, even if people are not very accepting of pluralism, they're not very accepting of the idea of a recovenanted church either. But I think that the importance of the covenant is that, as I said, it floats free of the immediate political context in which it had been created. So it becomes a way in which I think, particularly for ordinary people in particular parts of Scotland, the covenant is a symbol of their own distinctive history and heritage within what is increasingly an unchallenged British state. From 1707, there's an incorporating union between England and Scotland. The Scottish Parliament is dissolved, and its representative rights are absorbed into the Westminster Parliament. And we're still living in that union today. The Union of 1707 is still the one we're in, despite the devolutionary movements of the 1990s. But the covenant remains important because it's an unthreatening way in which Scots can think about their own history and heritage and talk about their own religious distinctiveness. The English, as long as the Scots don't push the covenant, it's not of interest to them. And so I think it has a longer lasting legacy, particularly for ordinary people, particularly when their own Church of Scotland seems to be a church that in the 18th and 19th centuries people are at odds with. It develops policies, which again is so complicated. I won't go into it, but yes, when people find themselves at odds with their church, you can return to the idea of the covenant, the idea of people being bonded together in fellowship with God,
Right.
in ways that I think sustain evangelical religion right across the 18th and 19th centuries.
Wow.
Today, the covenant has slipped from view, and lots of people don't know very much about it. And I think that's probably just as well. At the end of the day, the covenant is not inclusive in any modern sense of the word.
Hmm.
It's rabidly anti-Catholic. It's clear that it envisages a one true religion. It certainly doesn't think that people can't worship at all. So it's a very problematic document for a modern democratic state. But it's extremely important for understanding Scotland's own history and Scotland's own sense of its place in the world after an incorporating union has ended Scotland as a separate and sovereign kingdom. So it's a hugely important, difficult document, but we need to recognise how difficult it is and that its legacy is difficult. If we appreciate that, then yes, people should know more about it.
Wow. What a fascinating time. And it's so great that you have spent so much of your academic career studying this and writing about it. And the fact that your latest book, right, focuses in on these, these great questions that you've kicked around, and for us to be able
Thank you.
to learn more about all of that, and kind of that's why we do the things we do at the Center for Christian Histories, because we want people to understand those
Mm.
things, and understand how do I fit that background into my context of how I do whatever it is that I do, right? How I worship, or whatever else that might look like. So, uh, Professor Laura Stewart, thank you so much for
Thank
taking
you.
time with us
Been a
today.
pleasure.
Anybody who is watching, you'll be able to see in our notes and on our social media pages and other things like that, where you can find a copy of her book and more information about this particular subject. I hope that you folks will follow us on social media, which you'll be able to see as well. If you're watching all of this on YouTube, go back to our webpage at the centerforchristianhistory.com and learn things like what happened on any particular day in Christian history, as well as good deep dives like this that help us understand more. So thank you again.
Thank you.